Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
I'm MC Schrafel, University of Southampton, and a visiting researcher here at Microsoft for the summer. Some of you have seen me. The cool thing is that I haven't seen most of you sitting in this room, so that does mean that the MS Intern mailing list seems to work in terms of distribution. Thank you very much for making the time to come. And presumably you're all here because you'd like to get your papers published. And you're thinking about paper publishing right now, yeah? And are you sitting here because you know that you have a deadline before you wrap up your internship to get a paper done? No? Why are you here? Seriously, let's get some of that information out just to make sure that this work that you guys are going to do, we're going to do together, maps to what your hopes and expectations are. So you definitely said no. So what's bringing you here? Right there, right in front. Yeah.
Well, I'll have to write it afterwards. I mean, I don't have definite deadline, but no, I have definite deadlines by December of this year, but it's not by end of September.
Okay, cool. So you've got something in the offing and you're really thinking about planning ahead.
Well, there is like a requirement for entering some qualification exams that I would have that I need to submit the paper, so I need to submit.
So you've got a qualifying exam coming up and you need your something for that. Okay. Does anybody have a prospective deadline in terms of papers they want to submit for the work they're doing this summer? Okay. And you said semi kind of deadline.
I already submitted one where we might target another one in a month.
Okay. So since you're sitting here, would you be so kind as to share a couple of the questions that you have about paper writing that made you think coming to this was a good idea? Like what brought you here, basically? Yeah.
How to appeal to a wider audience. Sometimes you're writing cross-disciplinary papers and you have these different types of audience that you want to deal with at the same time.
Okay.
Explain your concept better.
So let's keep track of some of these ideas. Is that one is audience, and how do I communicate to reach these folks who might be a little bit outside of the normal domain that I write for? Okay, anything else? Yes?
Sometimes I'm working on a project that has different components. I was thinking that if I should publish 2 papers for different components, or I should concentrate on one smaller project to make a bigger contribution, have a better paper maybe. So what is the main contribution of the project and how to write it down?
So it sounds like there's a couple of things going on in there. Do you write a couple papers, or do you figure out also what's the contribution and how's the best way to frame that so that you can get some good results? Yeah? Okay. Anything else? Yes. And please tell us who you are. So.
Oh, I'm Chris.
Hi, Chris. Are you one of the persons that sent around a paper?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay.
I've been publishing more in psychology-oriented venues and HEI. And given that computer science was in the name, I figured this would be a good opportunity to actually know what are more computer sciencey people looking for in paper.
Okay, so this kind of comes back to this notion of audience thing again.
Because I can imagine that that's quite different from the other audiences that I've been targeting. So I'm aware that it's different. And
We'll find out about that.
yeah.
Okay. Yes?
Another question I had about the writing as a process. Often when we're preparing for a deadline, we have a specific way to go about writing as a process, but sometimes the way to write great papers is really editing, getting feedback, and so on. So,
Come on in. Okay, so is there a question there?
so the question is that how do people approach, if you're writing a paper that would have a lot of impact, how do people approach that kind of writing?
So how do people approach exactly
So the methodology, I guess, behind the writing process itself.
the methodology behind writing process? Okay. Does that sound fair? Is that okay? Method, process. Okay, anything else? Yes.
In a situation when your contributions are not exactly measured, so in a situation where your contributions are not exactly measurable and you can't set up an experiment with some exact numerical metric, how do you actually measure the experimental results of the study? How do you present what you've done, and why do you think it's important if you can't report numbers?
Can you give us an example? Sounds like you have a case in mind. The question, if you didn't hear it, was that what happens if you want to report something but you don't have numerical or quantifiable results? How do you present something so that you can say this is still worthy of publication? Is that the question?
Yes, that's actually questions. Well, for example, that could be an issue in HCIs, where you have something and you have a theory that it should simplify some typical user process.
Yes.
Yeah, but you can't exactly measure whether it's a simplification or not.
Okay.
Besides of user study.
Good grief. Okay, so what are measures of success? And how do you pick those? That's a broad one. Cool. Anything else? Yes.
Well, on a related note,
And tell us who you are.
my name is Sing Kyung Chen from University of Washington.
And you are?
Alex, I'm starting my PhD.
You sent around a lovely paper that had lots of quantitative stuff in it. And welcome. So go ahead.
So on a related note to the last question, I've had some experience. I've had some hard time publishing a qualitative paper in an HCI venue because it's really hard to measure the contribution in a quantifiable way. So a pretty common feedback from the reviewers are the results are very, it's for the qualitative paper, the result seems not so novel enough.
Okay.
That's the common feedback in the qualitative paper.
Okay. So another related thing to measures is novelty in terms of the contribution. Okay. Anything else you want to kick off with? Yeah, back here. One sec. Sure. Yeah.
Hi.
And tell us who you are.
I'm Arya from UIUC. So in any paper, there are some questions that the authors have to answer in terms of justifying their choices, some questions about the problem itself, why they've seen this problem, why it's and so forth. So it's always a challenge for me to where in the paper and how to address it. So is it way too early? We don't have the context, but if we don't do that early enough, the reader might be disappointed.
So where do you put the problem?
Where you put the problem or justification of this is an important problem, our approach is good.
Thank you for asking that. That one we'll actually be able to tackle really intensely today. Okay, so I'm going to note that down just so that we've got that problem and justification. Okay. And you guys were nodding. Is there a reason you were nodding vigorously to that last comment? You were nodding too. Any reason?
Oh, it's something that you
comes up
when you write it, but I have thought about.
Okay, super. And Erin, you had a comment or question?
I've got actually a couple over here.
Okay.
How do you effectively write a position paper?
A position paper. Okay.
Position paper.
Okay. Uh-huh.
And we have one other that just came in, and that was determining the order of authors.
Oh. Yeah. Okay.
The last one was actually mine, and that's for me. My thing is always shaping up an introduction and discussion. Those are the things I struggle with.
Okay. Intros and discussion.
You know already.
Okay.
There's
Yes.
one question on the problem. The justification one, where do you put related work? Should it come at the end or in the?
I have some very strong practice views about where related work goes, especially as a reviewer, so I will share that. This whole thing, so let me put that up here. This whole thing is not about absolutes. It's about what I'm learning in the medical community is often referred to as evidence-based practice. So I'm going to share with you, and we're going to work through some examples of answering some of these questions, or let's say beginning to address them as opposed to assuming we'll have hard answers, that are based on experience from the writing side, from the reviewing side, from putting conference and journal programs together, whether special issues of journals or conference programs. And again, based on that, you can then test any of the claims that I make by going back and reading successful or influential papers. And of course, the ways that, well, why don't you tell me some of the ways that you can assess whether a paper is successful or influential? Yeah.
Citations?
Citation counts are certainly a great one. My favorite type of papers that get cited are the ones that are initial off the blocks and that everybody says, but this was crap. And then they have to go back still and cite that paper. Those are awesome papers. It's like, I want one of those papers. Anything else that tells you whether a paper is successful?
The journal that publishes them.
Okay, that's great. So that we know now that things like a particular conference or journal has a particular status. You get into that thing, that says something. You've had some impact there already by being invited in. Is there anything else that might be...
Whether it's changed the field or something like that, which is harder to measure. But
field changing can be really important. That's true. Paper awards, yep. Awards can be another measure of some kind of criteria of something about it was liked by somebody at some point, for sure. If it got its authors a job, yes, and that's interesting. The other thing, of course, is if it helps somebody who's in an academic position to make tenure, or it helps somebody else hang on to a job in terms of these kinds of effects. So, thank you. Is there anything else you want to throw out here before we got going? Yes, Alex?
It has some practical input in terms of a product of an industry. It's related to some industry.
Right. You might actually have a paper that is not highly cited by other academics, but might be pointed to as where something started, or was the first part of something that became a product in terms of tech transfer and so on. So there are all sorts of measures of impact and influence around papers by which we would measure their success. But what we can, oh, sorry, were you going to add something? No, okay. But what we can come back to pretty consistently, and you've also mentioned about writing across disciplines or thinking about disciplinary audiences, what we can pretty much consistently focus on is how core elements of a paper, of a successful paper, of something that we'd enjoy reading, are conveyed. So there's a couple of things that we'll definitely be able to touch on today and get into some gnarly detail, so a little bit better than touching on. But there's other things that we'll need to come back to in the follow-up the following week, and I'll let you know here's why. So in terms of looking at the method, the process of writing, a little bit on measures of success, problem justification, intro and discussion. So these guys, a lot, author order, we'll do that right away. Intros and discuss. So these guys we'll get to specifically today. What will be sort of the outcome of this in terms of practice between now and next week so that you get some real practice around thinking through these concepts and can test them? We'll come on to these questions about audience, how to write the position paper, and scoping, and even the related work issue further next time, because the question will be on you in terms of practicing some of the principles we talk about today to see how they help begin to address these questions. So I would encourage you over the next little while to think about whatever project it is you think you're going to have to write up next. We'll look at doing a practice abstract, intro, and conclusion for them, even just roughing them out to see what some of the challenges might be. And a second ago when I was talking about, how do we know that a paper is impactful, that connects back to this notion between now and next week, while you're developing your own work, of also validating any claims made here today. Is that if you find from what we're going to go over today that you can then go and look at existing papers that are successful against whatever criteria you've just chosen, you can say, well, how many of the things that we talked about in this workshop are actually showing up in the papers that are deemed to be successful? And not all of them will necessarily be there all the time, but my bet is that you will start to see most of the things we go over in really good papers, and we might also come up with a definition of what a really good paper is from a slightly different criteria than what might be happening in your head right now. So let's just check that out. We're going to get into the specifics in a moment, but now that we've kind of scoped the space out of where we're at today and where we'll go next week, here's a general question for you. And the reason I come on to this, I've got this term over here called targets and aim. There's a guy by the name of Tony Blauer who teaches combatives. Have any of you done martial arts combatives, anything where you've gotten to hit people for a legitimate reason? I'd encourage you to consider that as part of your life practice. It can be very satisfying, especially when trying to write a paper. He says it's if you don't have a target, it's very difficult to aim. And part of what we're trying to do when we're communicating about research and writing a paper is we need a target to aim at to figure out what is a successful paper. So what would you say right now are some of the attributes of a great paper? It might not be something you've actually thought about to say, yes, I could tell you in 2 sentences what a great paper is. But if that's what we're aiming for, well, actually the topic of the workshop was not necessarily to write a great paper, it was to write a successful paper. But if you want to think that the two probably go together a lot of the time, yeah, what are some attributes?
It attracts the audience through its title and abstract, because out of a large quantity of papers, it gets them interested, and then gives them enough details in the introduction that if they care about the problem, they'll go through the entire paper.
Okay, so there's something in there, if I can summarize that a little bit, about attraction. There's something that draws in a reader and makes some kind of connection. Anything else? So it's connecting with a reader somehow. Yeah.
Contribution to the fields.
It makes a contribution, or it articulates a contribution. So,
contribution.
Sorry?
A significant contribution.
Okay, we want to have significant, do we? Okay.
Well, I think both of these, they have nothing to do with writing a paper. This is like choosing your research topic properly. I think when you write the successful ingredients, it's stating the problem clearly and show that you solved it.
Well, yeah, I think more listing why it's important.
Making a contribution depends on what you started doing research. If I'm trying to prove in a theorem that nobody cares about, I still have to publish.
Okay.
We're all saying a good paper comes out of good research. Well, I know, but like...
So that was true.
So somebody has to care. You sound like a real skeptic there, Walter.
I am not the most optimistic person in the world.
So, okay, so we've got this notion of somehow the framing of the paper is attractive, and we'll unpack what attraction is in paper writing. There's some notion of a significant contribution, and you've been arguing that significance has something to do with the fact that somebody agrees that what you're doing is worth doing in some way.
Should be clear enough to be, the contributions should be stated clearly. People should not just...
So that gets into the attraction thing, okay? Clarity. Good observation. Let's hang on to that. Anything else that you would say is about a successful paper? Remember, this is science that we're usually talking about, so things...
Many of my favorite papers, this is something I have to admit, I don't know exactly how they do it, but it's written in a way that it seems timeless. The person, just by reading it, it exudes experience,
they describe the problem not as, I had a problem, I solved it, but describe it in a way that the whole community identifies with the problem and the whole community can accept the solution.
Are you thinking of any particular examples where that's actually made it through a review process?
Nothing specific.
Definitely come up with some examples. If you've got that belief in mind, there must be papers that go with it. As soon as you started talking about that, I was thinking about Vannevar Bush's As We May Think. If you haven't read it, it is now well regarded as a classic in terms of being both visionary, what some of you might even call a position paper, and was game-changing repeatedly in a field. In fact, when Jim Gray gave his Turing Award talk in the late 90s, early 2000s, I forget which exactly when he got it, he referenced that work as inspirational. So I'd check that out. Do you have your hand up back there as well? No? You're just resting comfortably? Okay. Anything else? So again, find an exemplar. Especially a current one would be fabulous. Anything else that goes into your ideas of a good paper? Yes?
Well, so given that we want to get more to the writing type of stuff, so clear language, well written, it's clear what the goal is of every paragraph, where the story is going.
Okay, so we've got...
The writing is crisp and...
So we've got a notion of clarity again. And you also said something about notion of where we're going, which is this idea of
narrative or something. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, at the back.
So I think if a paper introduces something new, not just some incremental work, like something useful and new, that is a successful paper.
So that's a successful paper that you're providing again. I think that sort of relates to this notion of significance, a contribution that you care about. If it's novelty, it's a value that you would recognize. That will help. There's a value proposition there. Yes?
So the question is a successful paper in points of view of the author or a good research? Because based on the answers, I feel that the answers are what is a good research. So if you have done something and you cannot change the research, then a successful paper for an author is the paper that gets accepted in a good conference, right?
I'm not sure what your difference is that you're making.
Like a successful research, when you want to start doing your research, or if you've done a research and you want to write a paper about it. And then what is a successful paper is a paper that is accepted, right?
The one that's accepted, yes, I suppose. I've heard friends of mine who are pilots talk about flights that way, that says the one they can walk away from was a good flight.
But related to that question, it also, so I feel that there's a notion of, you can do sort of type bad research, of course you can do bad research, but most of the time when you start up with a research question, there is a reason why you're doing it. And sometimes the results aren't what you expected it to be, and it can feel like you did a bad job, but you can still write a successful paper because there was a reason why you did it, right? And although that might not be the...
Your background is psychology, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Where that happens less.
Well, no, I'm just listening to you talk about the motivation of the paper and doing the paper, and it sounds very much influenced by a psychological background, as opposed to an engineer's background who might just want to say that the successful paper is when you can walk away from that the reviewers accepted.
But it might be when you build something as an engineer without knowing too much about it, it might just not work, but theoretically it might have worked. So it was, at the start it seemed like a plausible thing you did, but then at the end it feels like, hey, I didn't get anywhere, but that could still be a successful paper. That's what I'm trying to...
The number of papers, sadly, that are accepted that talk about negative results is a whole other area of discussion that we can get into. But for right now, we're going to assume that you've done something and you have a result that you can report that is not a negative result. Not saying that you shouldn't be able to produce, in fact, as I said, there's an entire argument in computer science, engineering, and so forth that says we don't publish enough of our failures. Be that as it may, not changing that today, We're going to focus on results where we can say, yes, we got this out of it. In fact, there's a certain art to having a hypothesis where you start with saying, this is what we're going to test and you get something else at the end, and you have to sort of reframe what you're trying to write. That's okay. That's the process of discovery as opposed to rewriting history and in terms of your work. But let's hold on that thought about the degree to which one can report on success or not. Okay? We can do that today? So we're going to idealize the cases a little bit. So again, some of the things that we've got here about the notion of a successful paper, yes, agreed, if you're not that happy with the result, but you still get it into a good conference and people like it, even better, and it gets cited, even better, great. In terms of successful papers, I think where we want to focus is how do we get that paper to that point where somebody will let it into a venue to be judged by our peers even further than the reviewing process. So how do we get to that walk-away point, if you will, and then can begin to judge it on these other categories of visionary and so forth, and field changing and so on. We have to get through the gate most of the times to do that. You've all highlighted some really important attributes of where we're aiming to get with this notion of successful paper. We've got notions that the writing has to be clear. People have to be able to understand what we're saying. That's good. That's not easy if we don't practice writing. One of the things that I mentioned, I think, in the blurb for this, and I'm just going to put it down here, is the notion of practice and reps, or repetitions, which is why I'm suggesting a writing assignment, an example to actually practice writing intros, abstracts, and conclusions over the coming week, whether they're ones you keep or throw away, is that writing is a skill. Paper writing is a skill. The whole point of this targeting exercise is to give you some components to focus on so that you can checklist your own writing to say, have I got this component in my paper so that I can practice making sure that it's there. And these are actually checklists that the groups that I work with and the folks that I write with, we go through as we iterate on a paper. Back here we were talking about method and process of writing a bit. Generally speaking, when we start working on a new research problem, when I got here at the start of the summer in June, in early June, with the group that I'm working with, one of our first questions was, based on the things that we're interested in doing, how would you imagine writing up the paper for that? If you assumed that you were going to get some results from this, once we'd spec'd out the idea a little bit, what does the paper look like? What could we possibly say the contributions might be? Saul Greenberg, a researcher in Canada, has this great thing in HCI about, that was extremely influential for me, was if you imagine the study you're going to run, what are the optimal results that could come out of that? And if you had those optimal results from that study, what could you say with them? That's a fabulous way to assess whether what you're doing is significant or trivial. Run the experiment in your head, get to the results, imagine making the statements about contribution, and see what you've got. And if you're not happy with what you think is the contribution coming out of that study or that work or whatever analysis you're trying to do, it might be a great way to say, we have to change something because this is not taking us far enough down the road to be worthy. Sometimes, however, I would encourage you to reality check your assumptions. If you run the experiment in your head and you get to the contributions of what you think that paper is going to produce or what that work will produce for writing up in terms of results, check with a couple of people you're working with. Check with your line manager, your supervisor, and see if they're saying, you're being too hard on yourself. There's actually a really good nugget in there that is useful for pursuing. So one other sort of tip within this is once you've run your ideas, always check them with somebody else that you respect, because we always tend to be harder on our own ideas than might necessarily be the case. In fact, the quality of some of the best folks I've had the opportunity to work with is that they are very supportive of other people's ideas and trying to raise them up, and they are extremely critical on their own and thinking, yeah, but that's not really gonna, no, that's brilliant, you've just cured cancer. Oh no, that's not enough for today's work. You know, you work with people like that? It's like, ugh. Okay, so if we assume then that this takes practice, then it's because there are skills that we can practice. And again, the connection of this meeting is in order to get at some of these skills that will help actually take this, which is still fairly fuzzy. You know, you want to be clear, but clear about what? You want to draw the right reader in, draw them into what? You've got a few attributes here around novelty and value and the fact that you want a path. Fabulous. But what does that mean when it gets home and you actually have to do it? So let's take a sense of this in terms of this notion, potentially, of roles. And by roles, it's like, what is our job when we're writing, and what is our job when we're reading? So one of the key questions you might want to ask in terms of developing this notion of what to focus on for skills here is, when we're not writing, when we're reading, where do you, okay, let me rephrase that. When do you start to go to your digital libraries to look for other people's work? Like, when do you have to bother to read somebody else's paper? You would start. Before you start what?
Well, running an experiment or something, you need to know that someone hasn't done it already.
Yeah, someone doesn't know it already. Okay, go on.
When in my master's, it was a requirement before you started the project. The very first step of the project was analyzing related work and producing an internal report.
Now, how can you get to analyzing related work as the first step of the project if you don't know what the project is?
You have a general idea what the problem you're trying to tackle is.
Right. So the first step is really coming up with your problem. And okay, if you're inheriting a space, then let's assume you've done that. Okay, but I do think you need to have a problem that you want to think about, generally speaking. I mean, you could just go to a digital library and start reading. Some people do that. Some people make time to do that. That's actually one of the best roles of professional magazines like the ACM Communications or IEEE Compute is fabulous because it lets you dip into many places in many fields that you wouldn't otherwise hit. One of my other colleagues has a philosophy of setting aside an hour a week blocked off on his schedule simply to read through those magazines to find out what's going on, not just in the space that he works in, but in related areas. And the opportunities for serendipitous discovery of potential new colleagues and related work from that practice is very worthwhile. One of the key tips there, though, is make it a block in your schedule or it won't happen. Your reading block. It's very, very useful. Okay, so we have this notion that we read other people's papers when we're trying to find out if the great idea that we've just come up with has already been done. Any other reason for going to related work? If not, create the problem, solve the problem, right?
Another interesting one is when I'm trying to write related work, I often try to see how people have cited others' work, in what context they have done that.
So that's nice too, is that the great thing about a good related work article is you can find a lot more related work to your problem already sussed out for you. But it all gets back to sort of the same thing, is to what degree has somebody else already worked in this space so that I can make my work distinct from theirs? So my question to you is, what do you look for, or what do you read when you're trying to figure that out? Where are you going? Yes, I'm assuming that you're able to find the papers that you want, but how do you, okay, let's assume you've got this list of papers, you put some search terms in, you've got the list of papers. What are you looking at first? Really?
Titles.
Yeah. So just in terms of thinking about your reader, you being in this position, if somebody else is going to read your paper in the future, they've gone to Google Scholar, they've seen it, the first thing that's going to hit their eyes, probably, is a title. So if you're thinking future thoughts about framing a successful paper, have a care about the title. Okay. So just real simple stuff is that if somebody's trying to answer a question about their work, what cues might the title give somebody, whether they want to click the link that is that paper?
Having some keywords about the main contributions in the title.
Nice, nice. So some kind of description in the title that maps to a concept. And again, this is the first thing that you can start to check and validate. This is this evidence-based medicine, if you will, of being able to say, if you look for the well-cited papers in your area, take a look at the title and see what kinds of descriptors, or what's been used here is the notion of a keyword, actually comes up in the title that might encourage somebody to look further at the work. So that's the first hook, if you will, into creating a connection with a potential reader. Now that's, again, not all papers are going to have wonderful titles that you would think of. They might simply start to get the ball rolling. Somebody's seeing it and referencing it. Great. What else do they see in that list of Google Scholars?
Abstract.
Oh, before you even get to the abstract, because you can't see the whole thing in Google Scholar.
Authors and keywords.
Yes. There is another opportunity, and it's growing hugely with papers and trying to find papers, is the use of keywords. Personally, I have been utterly negligent in filling in keywords in the history of time that I've been writing papers because I had no idea what they were actually being used for by any human being. It turns out that increasingly we are taking advantage of keywords in search. So keywords are another opportunity for helping your paper surface up in terms of what people you might want to have reading your work would be looking for. So this is another place to have a care, is consider the keywords that you use to describe your work. Things like the domain that it's in. If you're doing HCI, put HCI. If it's semantic web, put semantic web. Why? Again, this is becoming useful in terms of algorithms that are discovering papers and making associations of what comes up in lists. So don't be afraid of stating the obvious in your keywords and thinking about how other people might want to discover this. In fact, something you might want to do with your group is test out whether your keywords seem to describe what's in the paper and connect with other domains. Go to Google, go to Bing, test out those keywords and see what comes back in terms of academic search or not. And if it doesn't bring back what your expected results are, find the words that will. This again is about helping the reader connect with your work. So that gets down to a question we're going to be looking at about writers. For whom are we trying to do this? Ourselves, yes, to get our publication out. But people who are going to be making judgments initially about these are readers. So this is really looking at cues to help readers initially. We haven't even gotten to the introduction yet. You also mentioned that you have authors. Now, you might think that there's not a whole lot you can do about this. But this is just a slight philosophy thing. I mean, you might be thinking, well, these are the people that I'm working with right now. Please feel encouraged to branch out to people in your field to collaborate on work. There is often a concern that collaboration might harm the opportunity to put your foot down in the ground and say, this is my space. For instance, there are some well-known names in my field, in HCI, that if their name is somewhere in the paper, you can kind of forget if you're an author on that paper. Even if you're the first author, the person they remember is the big name person. But you know what? Sometimes that's really okay, especially if your paper gets read and cited and the work starts to get known. There's nothing like a good introduction at a cocktail party or a coffee social or anything else like this. Being in good company is being in good company. In the UK, where I'm located, they have this notion of buying a round of drinks, that if you buy a round of drinks for everybody, the next one somebody else will buy the round, and so the cost of the evening's imbibing is shared in that respect. A colleague of mine back there, Dave Deror, suggests that paper writing can often be like buying a round. If you're open to the possibilities of collaborating and encourage co-authoring of work, what goes around comes around. And again, that's not about readers, writers, that's about a community of scholarly practice. But sometimes that author list can be extremely valuable to your work being discovered. So it's something that you can actually think about influencing in your paper writing. So before we've even gotten to the body of the paper, we've been thinking about this notion of roles in terms of where are we actually putting this paper? The paper exists, yes, as you've pointed out, on our CV as a mark of where we're at professionally. So it acts not just as translating knowledge from one place to another, but also simply as, if you will, a credit check on us professionally. Where have we published, with whom, how often, over what period of time? These are all questions that are asked about us in various professional contexts. But when we actually look at getting the paper that we want read, presumably that's also why we're writing, is not just to build up a career portfolio and get a job, though that is completely worthy and understandable, because it is good to eat. It is also, I find, good to eat and weather places like this in a dry environment. So being able to afford food and shelter is a very worthy goal. And if you're doing this kind of research practice, part of sustaining that is definitely having publications. Assuming that, most of the time the role that we actually need to focus our skills practice for is for readers. What we've talked about here is the times at which we become readers and look for other people's work, and therefore as writers what we need to think about to help that work be discovered. We've looked at just a couple of heuristics for being able to succeed there, which is having a descriptive title. It's great to also have the name of whatever thing you've invented, and then colon, descriptive title. And again, this is evidence-based. You can check this. See how many of the papers that you're looking at in your related work follow that model of some kind of cool name or abbreviation, colon, followed by boring description. But the boring description is really effective as for these things that we've talked about. Yes?
How long can the boring description be?
As long as you have lines for, and I'll tell you what, one of the main heuristics for figuring out the length of your title is how much space you actually have left in the size of the paper that you need to cut. If you find you've got a 10-page paper and it's gone to 10 pages and 2 lines, and you know that frickin' title takes up this many points, time to shorten the title. It's one of the places.
Like if you write a too long title, it can people just don't read it.
It depends on the field. If you take a look through PubMed, especially in chemistry papers, you will see some amazing titles that are 6 lines long.
Yeah. For me, though, if I read a paper which is called, I'm looking, let's say, for a paper on solving linear equations, and I find a paper which is called Solving Linear Equations, that's perfect. if I find a paper using interpolation of the second order, blah, 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 to solve linear equations, is already odd. I go to the other one.
Well, again, it depends who you're writing that paper for. Because if you want to focus down on a particular derivative or second order, whatever that you want as your focus, and this is what you want people to find, and those are the readers you're going for, that amount of description can be really valuable. And in that case, you've succeeded, because if your paper is written in such a way that it would actually be a waste of time for somebody who hasn't even gotten past the solving the first part of this problem, who's not that sophisticated, then you've helped them. That, I'm skipping this paper, is a really good decision to be able to make. I don't know if you guys have had this experience yet where the title promised so much and the paper delivered so little. Hate that. But that's what can happen with a title that does not really map to the body of the work, is that, again, I have great sympathy for readers, because as you get on in this practice and you're asked to review more, you become more often a reader than a writer. And so anything that lies to you, where you feel betrayed in your trust as a reader, sets up a very poor relationship between you and that author anytime you see their work again. Seriously. We have memories of these kinds of things. We are wired to remember in order to avoid negative experiences. And so if we have a title that promised much and delivered little, and we look at who the authors are, it's like suddenly our trust in that author goes down, and we remember that the next time we see their papers when we're asked to review something. And in a community, we certainly do. So this notion, again, I don't know if I put the word down here, but roles is going to come up. We're writing to establish trust as well with our audience. We want our audience, our readers, to be able to trust what we've given them. So again, having the title and the keywords and so on map to what we're about to deliver is kind of our first place that we make a promise. And we're going to use this notion of promises quite a bit. Now that you've figured out some titles, we can actually get to the notion of what you've been wanting to talk about. After you read the title and you've clicked on it and you want to see if this is a paper you want to read, what do you do next? Yes, here we can talk about abstracts. So what is the role of an abstract? Again, here's your thumbnail description. What's the abstract supposed to do? In brief.
Summarize what the paper's about.
Okay, that's very much an author-centric way of talking about the role of the abstract.
Let the reader know what he'll get out of the paper so that he doesn't have to read it to get that figured out.
Okay, so that's definitely one role, is one thing, but not all readers are male, is that readers are looking for something about which they can make a decision. And you've just said, an interesting thing about abstracts is you want to have enough information to know if you can cite this thing without having to read the thing. That's fabulous. That also assumes, therefore, that the abstract is accurate. I'm not sure how many of you have gone through the mapping procedure to say, this abstract said that it did this, but when you read the method, it's like, really? Did it actually do that? I don't know that what it delivered actually maps to its claims in the abstract. This might be more an issue in some of the PubMed stuff than in computer science, but that's certainly been an experience in PubMed. So that's one thing about a decision point is this something that I may want to cite without having to read it? What's the other decision? Yeah?
Would someone really cite it, actually add their work cited from their own paper without reading it?
Of course.
Some people cite just because it's cited in another paper without reading. You don't even have to go and read the abstract.
Sometimes your reviewers tell you to cite things you didn't read.
Okay, I'm a Puritan.
You cite by induction. You cite the cited things.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't tell you how many times that. And let's not have some judgments up here. You might find yourself in a position in the future where you are looking for making assessments about whether your area of work has been discussed, and you want to cite, there are 252 papers that have covered this topic. And you've gone through the experimental method expressed in the abstract of the piece to know sufficiently that, yes, this is one of those papers without having to know it in detail. So whatever judgment you want to make about that, yes, there are people who will cite something they haven't read, and that can become very clear when you're reviewing stuff as well, that they either didn't read the paper or they so severely did not understand it that both are really interesting problems. So this is a decision point about even deciding whether you're going to read it. The other decision is, if you want to cite it, is do you want to read it to begin with? So you're making a decision. If you've gotten past the title and now you're reading the abstract, presumably the decision point you're asking is, do I need to read this paper? What pile does it go in? The emergency, I must read this paper right now because it looks so good, or the I'll get to this one later when I'm really checking out stuff. So if the decision on a reader's part is, do I want to read this paper? Does it look like it's worth me spending time in my life that I will never get back, those precious minutes? And when you think of it that way, the abstract's kind of important. What do you think needs to go into the abstract when you're providing this evidence for people to help make this decision? What do you want to see?
What's the problem they're solving?
Beautiful. What's the problem? How'd they solve it? Anything else?
And to what extent it's solved, and if they can hint at
results. Beautiful. This is the map of the universe, right here. What would you say is the difference between this map and an introduction for your paper? Okay, length is definitely one measure. Besides length, that would assume that they're kind of just one's compressed version of the other. Yeah.
And we don't put related work here.
Sorry?
No related work.
So well, that's interesting. That's interesting. So let's hang on to that. Usually in computer science, you do not see related work specifically cited in the abstract. That's not true in all cases, in all fields. Anything else?
Than on the actual result.
Okay, so there's some notion that the intro is going to spend a little more time on the problem, and the rest of the paper might map out the solution results. We'll see if that's true. Anything else about differences between intro and abstract besides length and focus on problem? Yes?
How is it? One thing is to explain what you are able to get with your method, like the solution, or one is how do you get it, like which technique you use. So you don't go deep into the technique you're using. So
in the abstract, you mean? You don't go deep into...
You have to go
okay.
after the introduction.
Cool. So the abstract, again, is really helping somebody understand what the main content is of the paper. The cut to the chase, if you will, elevator version of the complete snapshot of the paper in terms of what's the research problem that you're looking at, how did you solve for that problem, and what are the specific results. This heuristic of what is in an abstract, I challenge you to go and read, especially in the ACM Digital Library if you're in computer science, read abstracts against this heuristic and see how well computer science papers in particular follow this model. I'll give you a hint of my bias here, is that we're terrible at writing good abstracts. The sciences are brilliant at using this model for helping people decide whether or not to read a paper, because it gives enough of the meat of the detail of the paper to make that decision. So it's very well worth doing because it helps somebody make that decision. Is this a paper worth me spending my time on? Is it not? And how we often get that is also out of how did we solve the problem? What approach did we use in solving this? And what are the specific values that are significant? What did you find? Huge value in spending time doing an abstract. Do it at the end of the paper, if you will, after you've finished everything else so you can get this nice synthesis. The next thing we're going to spend a little bit of time on, the time we've got left today, is the intro and a little bit on the conclusion. And if we've got time, we'll look at some of the examples that you sent around. If we do not get a chance to look at the examples that you sent around, I would encourage you to use these heuristics to read the 4 papers that I sent around to everybody who has signed up here that have been contributed by members here, to say, oh, to what degree did this follow these heuristics, and is it okay not to? Conclusions are another weak spot in our presentations usually that could use some attention. We'll come back to why in a sec. Okay, so far we've got a nice map in terms of, again, our role of writing for readers. I've used this notion of trust here, is when we're communicating with readers, implicit in this is that we want our readers to feel safe and believe what we're writing. When we are acting as readers, it's not a comfortable place to be, to go, how the hell did they do this? Or, I don't believe that they were able to pull this off. Or, you call that a sample size? Any of those kinds of responses that we have are generally because something's been queued up in the paper that has caused us to lose trust, question our trust, or actually not feel safe with the groundwork that the reader is creating. Part of the role of the introduction is to make the path for what our great invention is going to be safe for the reader. And the safety comes from some of the things you've already articulated. So we're going to look at these in terms of this other topic here. We've talked a little bit about notions of papers, who they're written for. We're getting into some heuristics now around, we've talked about abstracts and intros a little bit. We're going to come back to that. But the biggie that you've cited on for the abstract is this notion of the intro problem. We said we've got the map of the world right here. Problem, solution, results. It needs to be spec'd out a little bit more. And where I'm taking us now is to suggest that the role of the intro is to build trust and safety for the reader to be able to believe the meat of the paper, which is going to be where we talk about exactly what it is we did and how we did it. So the intro is crucial. In fact, Ravin Balakrishnan and somebody else that I worked with at the University of Toronto, who's a very well-published, well-regarded HCI researcher, has a heuristic about reviewing that he says the introduction is where a paper is won or lost in the review process. The quality of the introduction has that much of an influence on how the rest of the paper is being read and whether it will be accepted. One of his heuristics for papers, and you can go check this with any of the papers he's published and any of the people he's published with, is always have a picture of your system on page 1. Why do you think that having a picture on page 1 is a good idea?
Gives a nice overview of what you're about to show them.
Can give a nice overview. Anything else? If you're thinking about impact?
It sticks with the reader.
Yeah, if you've got a ton of papers that are just plain pages, if you've got some kind of image, we're wired for vision. We lock onto vision and we remember visual cues. So that's almost a way of reinforcing the title and the keywords. So thinking strategically about what that image is for the first page, along with a good intro, can be extremely valuable. Okay, so if we want to build safety and trust. Yes, what was that question?
So picture may be relevant in the HCI, but in some other fields, it's like you're not supposed to put any picture in the first.
If you're not supposed to put any picture on the first page, you better not. If your field wants something that looks bloody boring and like everybody else's, then at least you're playing in that field. I have, however, found sexy use of equations to be quite persuasive. Tables are also high-value items. Now, and I say that just generally, tables are great visuals because it's something that everybody will go look at in a paper as a summary of what has been proposed. I'll give you another quick one. Judicious use of headers, section headers. If a person can effectively read your paper by looking at the headers, boy, have you created value for that reader with your paper. It helps them follow the map that we're going to build. Okay, so let's do a little bit. Is that okay back there? It's not a judgment on your field, really. It's again, conventions are really important. Finding out what the conventions, you've already asked about cross-disciplinary writing, finding out what the conventions of your field are in terms of formatting, expectations, ordering, sometimes where the related work goes, if there's not a strong convention in your field, that's the only time it's a question mark. There might be a strong convention in your field about where related work goes. But again, no matter what those principles are, the ones we're talking about here will cross disciplinary boundaries, and I can prove that, and we will look at that. But this notion of trust and safety, first thing, intros generally, especially for 10-page papers, are most of you writing about 10-page papers, conferencey papers, as opposed to the longer 40-page journal papers? The only difference here is that how long your intro needs to be. Like if you're writing a chapter for your dissertation, intro size is somewhat different, especially when the whole chapter is called introduction. But even in that case, we need to create this map for safety and trust. So the first thing, and again, this is the first thing I encourage you to read other people's introductions and successful papers for, is exactly what you've already mapped. What's the problem you're trying to solve? I would encourage you to avoid generalities like, in today's world, we have a lot of use of the web. Or numbers are really important. Any type of generalization is taking up precious space that is not helping the reader get to what you're trying to do. So, biggest thing to do first, and this is when you're doing your own writing of your abstracts and also of your fake intros for next week, this is the challenge. How quickly can you express the problem that you're trying to solve? If you can't do it quickly, my guess is that you're not entirely clear yet on what exactly the problem is you're trying to solve. A way of getting at that problem is to be able to identify two things. Well, actually, there's about 3 ways that you can do this, and depending on the problem, you will have a choice. If you can hit all 3, you've got a trifecta, great. Problem, in terms of proof of being a problem, who's it a problem for? If you're looking in the research, this is an insight from Patrick Winston at MIT, who does a great seminar on how to give a job talk. And he has this notion of the problem is something that you can cut in terms of time. For how long has it been a problem? We want to solve the traveling salesman problem. It's been a problem for a while. And you can cite NP completeness and et cetera, and this is where you could potentially lose faith with your reader, you lose trust because that's a not solvable problem. So what are you saying you're trying to solve this? What's going on here? But let's assume that there's been some problem that has been an open challenge since Alan Turing said it was. Whatever. You can use some sense of time in a problem. The other thing that you can point to are experts who have tried to solve this problem. So-and-so has tried to get at this solution for this problem by doing this, somebody else has tried to do that, and somebody else has tried to do this. So you can hit recognized authorities to show what the scope of this issue is. Related to this is actually groups. In terms of, at Carnegie Mellon, they've been trying to solve this problem for the past 10 years. What do you think this does in terms of our trust and safety map to be able to say the problem you want to solve has these components to it? How would that help you as a reader if somebody's telling you all these places that they're trying to solve this problem and this is how it's affected this community for the past 20 years? What does that do for your trust?
Well, it shows that the writer actually understands the problem.
Yeah.
And that they're able to express the problem.
Okay, so it shows one thing about trust is they seem to know something about the related work in the area. So the domain is safe. You can kind of trust that they've got an understanding of the domain. Anything else that this tells us? Yes, at the back? It's important. Lots of cool people are working on it. Anything else? Yeah.
Understands the complexity of the problem.
There's a sense of, yes, not only understanding, where this has been worked on, so some trust that they know the related work, they know it's important. They have a sense of it that if you know that area, would agree, yeah, that's a pretty good way of expressing the problem. So there's some sense of complexity, the scope of the problem, why it's hard. Okay. And in fact, that's something that you can be explicit about within this, is helping somebody understand two things. Why is this problem worthy of anybody's time? And what makes it challenging to solve? So why is it non-trivial? Why is it worthy? And by being able to scope the problem in terms of for how long and for who else, and you might say in what way, has it been hard, is part of it. And also you might want to be explicit about saying, running it down for the reader in terms of, why solve this? And that's heading towards potential contribution. You're not being explicit about the contribution yet, but you're saying, this is useful. So that is the first core piece of a paper, is being able to articulate the problem that's being solved and defend it in terms of the context, just as you would expect to look at a problem and solve it. Is this is not going into great detail on the related work. That'll come in its own section or throughout the paper, whatever the convention is for the culture, but it is making it safe for the reader. So that's how you know, how much related work do I have to put into the intro? How do I have to, you were asking earlier about how do I justify this problem? This is the solution to the justification question. If this doesn't exist, maybe your problem's not justifiable. But there's nothing like reference to time or authority for being able to support that the problem is worth doing and why the solution will be a benefit. Any questions about that part of it? Okay, so that's the first movement of your introduction. Again, if you're trying to build up trust and safety for what's to come, now that you've explained why the problem is being engaged in this paper, what do you think is the next thing you want to do in your introduction?
Well, you want to say how you're planning to tackle it, or what you
okay.
Hint at what the rest will describe.
Okay, so the next thing that comes up, let's call it the approach. This is, again, not to reiterate your methodology section, but simply to make it reasonable for your reader to believe that the way that you are approaching this is thought out and reasonable. So that if you say that this is a particularly difficult problem in these respects, are you saying, and to scope the problem a bit, are you saying that you're going to solve the whole thing, or that you're going to perhaps nudge the problem ahead? We haven't found the whole solution, but we're contributing this component which is going to enable all these other cool things to happen. So you get a chance to talk a little bit about the approach that you've taken. If it's an HCI, we ran a user study comparing the following 3 versions of this interface, or we tested out these 2 models of articulating what our design space was, and we used this user study. and using the user study would give us these values back, and so from that we're able to do whatever it is we're able to do. So sketching out the approach is, again, think of it as, if you were reading it, would you find this credible? So is the approach that you're going to take to solve your problem credible? And again, I'm emphasizing over and over and over again that the introduction is the map for your paper that is conveyed in such a way as to make your reader excited, have confidence in your approach, and feel safe. Again, to come back to this notion of articulate the problem up front, if you cut to the chase and describe the problem, you give the reader the chance to feel empathy for the problem you're trying to solve. If we don't do that, if we just describe something that happens a lot in papers, it says, this paper is about blah. We ran this study to show blah. The reader might not care. If we say, this is a problem that 7,000 million zillion people across the entire galactic universe are having right now. And if we solve this, we will save the planets of the universe this much energy, which will be used to keep the sun from dying before we're finished this conference. Wow, I'm motivated to want to read how you're going to do that. Because really, again, we only have so much time in our lives to do things. And why not help somebody feel as much passion and excitement for what we're doing as we do? And a fast way to do that is to present the reader with an opportunity to hook into the space of the paper. And the best way to do that is to say, this is the problem. This is why it's a horrible problem. This is why it's been a horrible problem for ages. And this is why contributing even this much of the solution is going to make life better. Because really what science is about, well, some might say science for science sake is just to discover the truth of the universe. My sense of it is that that's very nice, but it's almost better when it helps make our lives better. So can we excite people into thinking about how the solution for this problem is actually going to contribute anything to the world, to make our lives better, our days better? Is there some contributory value? So that's why once we get through that, people are willing to go, okay, how are you going to do it? How are you going to stop the sun from going out before the end of this conference? How are you going to do that? Wow, that sounds really cool. Are you building on somebody else's method? That's another opportunity for a little bit of related work to say, yeah, and we're using so-and-so's method, but it only got this far, so we found this really cool hook, and it's giving us a 72% improvement on the previous results. The other thing that you want to show again is, again, I come back to the notion of hard. If, for instance, you say you get a 72% improvement on past work, help your reader understand that that's actually really, really good. How would you help somebody understand that the level of success that you've had is really good as opposed to meh? What could you do in the intro?
Make some comparisons.
Yes! Comparisons are wonderful things. Do not be afraid to use them. This again is kind of getting at related work, is to say the closest advance other people's work in this space has made is 13%, which has done whatever it's done. 75% means what? When it's at home. What does 75% mean? Does that mean that it will only take us 2 years to translate the entire world's corpus of a particular language into another language? How can I get real about what that 72% means? I mean, it's a big number. It sounds good. It's almost 100%. But of what and why do I care? You know, I got fascinated by a student's work in electronics that was just talking about a particular kind of wrap on wire that was used in houses. And initially the introduction wasn't really doing much for me, and I said, why is this such a good thing, this insulation that you've come up with in homes? And he said, well, it's used in most of the houses in the UK, and it tends to set itself on fire. And so by changing this insulation around it, it's A, cheaper, and B, it means that houses aren't going to go poof. I was motivated to make sure that not only was that research successful, but that that person would get that work out there and the cable replaced in people's houses, and then to check if I had that kind of wiring in the place I was living. So that's how to make something real and meaningful to people. And it's not trivial to say that. Again, it's about making people's lives better very quickly. And especially the other thing that you could say is that the process was really cheap. Like the big insight there was success was we can do this at a fraction of what it costs right now to do the state-of-the-art. We can do it much cheaper, faster, better, and it has the potential to save lives by fewer people's houses getting set on fire. Sounds good to me. So again, is it hard to do? Well, that's the nice thing about the solution is that they can express that, yes, it was hard to do some of the problems, some of the things that they needed to understand about the polymers that they were doing, that was kind of challenging. And so that was the real research contribution that they had, but the social benefit contribution of how that research could be translated was fabulous. So their contribution was not only this neat polymer that they had built and why that was solving certain problems in plastics, but also the possibility of a social contribution. Yay, benefit. Okay, we're nearly at the end of the introduction. The next part of the introduction, after you've mapped out the introduction in terms of what your problem is, why it's a worthy problem, how you're going to go about presenting your solution for that problem, what do you think the next thing is in an intro?
Lay out what the rest of the paper is like.
Why do you do that? The answer was lay out the rest of the paper. Yeah, why do you do that?
So you can address the reader if you want to skip some parts or.
That's an interesting courtesy. Let me help you decide if you want to skip parts of my paper. But it's true. It's again this notion of what are you doing in the intro to establish trust and safety. It's also in this case, again, I said I'd use this word again, promise. The next part of the paper is the map of what's coming. This is the usually thought to be quite boring part of the paper in which you say, in the following paper, therefore, we will present the related work, and then we'll talk about our wonderful method, and we'll... Fine. Doing that lets the reader know what's coming, and they can be mentally prepared for how you're going to take them from what you've promised here to delivering it. It's this part about safety, comfort, familiarity. For instance, if that list doesn't have related work in there and that culture wants lots of related work and you don't have it in there, that reader's going to be freaking out going, where's the related work? So if, for instance, in a case like that, you don't have a related work section, you can have a sentence that says, we will be discussing the related work in context as it emerges through the methodology. Okay, I can relax now. I know why there's not a related work section. Help the reader relax, trust you, and be willing to go on the journey. I've spent so much time on two things here. The relation of writers to readers, as opposed to focusing on this is how to exactly write a paper. The reason being is I've been trying to give us some heuristics around why writing a paper this way is important. We've talked about the abstract in terms of its role for a reader's decision-making process. Do they want to read the paper? Do they not? Do they think it's going to be important for citations even if they just glance through it or not? We've moved from the role of the abstract over to the role of the intro. If you see this again in terms of reader decision points, the first decision point we've talked about is when they get through the title, the description, the keywords, the author list. They've gone to the abstract, deciding whether or not they need to read your paper. What decision are they making from reading the intro? If this one is about having enough detail to figure out they want to read the paper, what's this one? What decisions are happening in the intro? Yes, one could say globally it's about continuing to read the paper, but what else is happening? If we've been talking about trust and safety, what is happening here?
Do they identify with the problem and do they trust that you solved it in a good way?
So that there's a couple of things there. There is the notion of, I'm excited about this, I'm excited about the problem, and access, and also confidence. So by setting up something explicitly like the problem, you are giving readers access to your thinking quickly. You're not wasting their time. You're letting them into the problem that you want to solve, and they can decide then and there, yes, this is exactly what is meaningful to me, and I'm interested. This is written for me. This is not written for the author to just spill whatever they're thinking about. They've actually cared enough about me. Doing the mini related work and method section here, again, what's happening in the introduction, and think about it yourself when you're reading intros, is, do I trust what this person's telling me? That's one. Two, am I or am I not currently bored out of my mind? Boredom comes from two things, and in psychology this is well described by Csikszentmihalyi's flow. Boredom comes when we're either looking at, yeah, this is all trivial, like in today's world the web is an important computation device. Boring because we know that it's nothing exciting. Or you start in the deep end with such an abstruse formula that the person has no way of accessing it. Those are the two extremes of boredom. No challenge, so challenging you can't get any purchase. The sweet spot in the middle is where you help the person find, this was what inspired us about our research, trying to solve this problem. This is why it's important, and this is how we're going to get there together. And I promise to take you there by going through the following steps. So the intro is where the reader is making a decision about your work. And again, this is, if you're thinking about readers as reviewers, and this is part of the successful paper writing, of respecting the reader enough to think from the reader's perspective, to engage them, to be excited about the problem, and to give them a path to getting through your work. I'm going to take 2 minutes to talk a little bit about the conclusion and what we're going to do next time. Okay. The conclusion, what do you think the role of the conclusion is? I'm going to tell you, just because we're running out of time, it's not the place to repeat in small the paper. Hate conclusions that say, in this section we did this, and then we did this, and then we did this. You've already read the paper. If it was so bad that you have to have it repeated for you in the conclusion, there's a problem. What's the role of the conclusion? Sorry?
Future work.
That's a future work section.
I clearly state the results that you achieved, and maybe some also make a nice table that says we did these and
So
that.
key takeaway points.
Takeaways is a nicer way of putting it. Yes, you should have that table. As we've said, tables are very good to take away. So a very fast summary of what the work has done is very useful. But this is where you'd say, this is the contribution of the work. Okay? Contribution is your key takeaway. What the reader has just done given them that will help them advance their own research? How? All the stuff you talked about before about the game changer, about how is this advancing the field? What do we know now from having read the whole paper that we didn't know before? So if your intro sets up people to go on a journey with you, the conclusion is sort of like on the game shows where they say, tell them what they've won, Bob. It's like, you've gone through this whole paper. What did you get from it? Well, by bothering to go through the work of this paper, you now have how to construct a small moon launch system. From that system, you will be able to make it to the sun and reset its clockwork and be able to have the light continue on until the end of this conference. And that will be a good thing for humanity because. So this is where you have the opportunity to help the reader understand the value of the intellectual exercise they've just taken on, and not just what your paper did, the problem that it solved, but what bothering to solve that problem is going to do for the field, for research, and as a platform for future work, because you've got these takeaways. So again, heuristic-wise, what I would encourage you to do, should you decide to take up this mission, is between now and next week, write up a fake abstract for the work that you're thinking about, outline a fake intro, but definitely write up this is the problem this paper is solving. That first paragraph that just says, this is the problem space, that's the thing that I find working with students and colleagues we have to work on the most, is how do you get that problem statement really crisp and clear. And imagine that you have perfect results. What's that concluding paragraph going to be? Or two paragraphs. One that says, in sum, this work did blah. These are the contributions. Because you're going to imagine what those contributions are right now while you're working on this stuff. Otherwise, it's not worth doing. So the other stuff that I had here for you was just to look at the abstract intros and conclusions of the papers that were distributed. You can do that as a personal exercise, again, to apply the heuristics. And our heuristics are, because we're right on time now, is to take a look, heuristic 1, take a look at the title and description of the paper. Is that sufficient for you to make a decision about whether or not you'd want to read that paper? Take a look at the authors. Do you recognize any of them or where they're from? Do you have judgments about their institutions or their colleagues that might help you decide whether you think the work is credible? Does the abstract set out these 3 steps of problem, solution, and results? And especially when you are reading the introduction, do you have a clear sense of what the problem is that this work is about, how that problem has been defended, why solving it is valuable, whether the solution approach is credible, and how the paper is going to work? That's for the intro checklist. The conclusion checklist, which we invented ourselves, is your takeaways in terms of contribution. Is there somewhere in that paper's conclusion that tells you why you bothered to come here in the first place, that celebrates the fact that you have bothered to engage with that problem? Those are the 3 core attributes of papers. When we look at some of your examples, mail them to me. We'll go over them as a group with an eye towards answering these questions about how is a position paper potentially different than what we've talked about? How do we reach across different audiences? And if we do these following heuristics, do we need to worry too much about that? Yeah, and what part around the little stuff around conventions? How do we get a hold of that? And also, we'll get a better sense from you doing these practice intros of being able to figure out, how do I scope my contribution? Is it a 1-pager? Is it a 2-pager? Should I think about a conference, a journal, and a workshop? How do I figure this out? Here's another tidbit from Ravan Balakrishnan again. Great heuristic is always aim your work to go into the best venues. So you need to know what the best venues are. Do not think about second-tier conferences or journals when you're planning your research. Always aim high, because that's where the best success is and the most impact and the most meaning is. And if you're thinking about, it's fine to think about workshops and so on to stage the work, but always assume that you're going for whatever the best venue is for your field and assess whether what you're doing here will get you there. Because what else is worth spending time on? Because you're just, you can do it. This is a map to how to do it. Do you have any fast closing questions before we wrap up for today? Do you think you can take these heuristics and apply them to the papers you've been looking at? Because one of the things that would be great to come back with as a discussion is, do you start to read papers a little more critically now in terms of how they're shaped and what you would expect to look at for good papers? As a reviewer, if I can't clearly see what the problem is for a paper within that first couple paragraphs, it goes to the bottom of the pile. Seriously. Not because I'm going, oh, I hate this work sucks. Only partially that might be going on some part of my brain. It's happening because I have a stack of 20 to go through. This helps papers survive to get to further consideration. I guarantee it. Be clear about this, cut to the chase on these things. Your paper will magically rise, it's not magic, but it will rise to the top of the stack in terms of consideration because you're making life easy for your reader, and that's who you're writing for. Your CV, second, your reader first, because if it doesn't get through the reader, it don't end up on the CV. Good? Coming back next week? All right, I hope this was useful for you. If you have comments or feedback or anything, please just send me an email. You know what it is now, it's in your notes. Thank you very much. See you next week. Oh, don't worry about it. No, stop. Thank you.